Genesis 10 to 12 marks one of the biggest transitions in the Old Testament. Up to this point, Scripture focuses on the entire human family: creation, the fall, the flood, and the repopulation of the earth. But beginning in Genesis 12, the story narrows down to one man, Abraham, whose covenant with God becomes the foundation for all future Scripture. These chapters together show how God's work continues from generation to generation and how He guides His children toward His promises. Genesis 10 introduces the nations that grew from Noah's sons, showing how families spread across the earth. Genesis 11 shows humanity gathering again, this time to build the Tower of Babel, revealing how pride can lead people away from God's purposes. Genesis 12 then turns to Abram, a man chosen to begin a covenant that would bless all nations through faith, obedience, and willingness to follow God into the unknown. These chapters teach powerful truths. God remembers families, God watches nations, and God still calls individuals to stand apart and trust Him. Whether dealing with large groups or one heart at a time, God's work always moves forward. Genesis 10 opens with what many call the Table of Nations, a record showing how the world began again after the flood. While these verses list names, they represent real families, real lives, and real beginnings. Noah's 3 sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, each became the father of groups that would spread across the earth. These lineages were not random. They show that God continues His work through families, generations, and covenants. Japheth's descendants spread toward the coastlands, forming early peoples that would influence regions far from where the ark rested. Ham's descendants grew into some of the most powerful early civilizations: Egypt, Canaan, and others that appear repeatedly throughout Scripture. Though many of these nations later opposed the covenant people, their existence reminds us that all nations ultimately descend from God's children. Shem's descendants are listed carefully, because through Shem comes a line that eventually leads to Abraham. God is quietly preparing the covenant story, even in genealogies. These verses teach important truths about how God moves His work forward. First, God works through families. Even after worldwide destruction, He chose not to start over with new people, but to rebuild through Noah's family, showing that His promises continue through the generations. Second, this chapter shows the unity of the human family. No matter how different nations become, we all share a common origin. Third, it teaches that God watches over nations. Every group, every people, every family matters to Him. Though the names might seem distant or unfamiliar, they represent the beginning of cultures, languages, and histories. God sees all of them. He remembers where people came from, and He knows where they're going. Genesis 10 invites us to see our own family history the same way. We, too, come from generations shaped by God's hand. And just like Noah's descendants, our families, no matter how ordinary, fit into God's great plan. Genesis 10 verses 15 to 25 moves from simple family lines to the birth of nations and early civilizations. These verses describe the descendants of Canaan, people who would later become central figures in Bible history, such as the Sidonians, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, and others. These groups eventually occupied the land of Canaan, the very land God would later promise to Abraham. Even at this early stage, the Lord was shaping the world where future covenant stories would unfold. We also see the rise of the first cities. Early people began building permanent settlements, organizing communities, and establishing systems of leadership. While these civilizations were not always righteous, their growth shows humanity doing what God commanded, multiplying, spreading, and filling the earth. The Bible is honest about the complexity of human choices. Some nations followed righteous principles, while others turned to pride or violence. But through it all, God remained aware of His children and continued guiding history toward His purposes. The genealogy of Shem's line introduces a significant detail. In the days of Peleg the earth was divided. This phrase likely refers to a major moment, either geographic separation or, more likely, the division of languages at Babel. The Bible shows that even when the world appears chaotic, God is still in control. Human choices may scatter people, but God's plan remains steady. He works across centuries, patiently preparing for the covenants He will reveal through Abraham. This portion of Genesis teaches us that God is involved in the rise and fall of nations. He is not distant from world events, but lovingly guiding them toward His promises. Civilizations grow, families spread, and generations pass. Yet God's purposes move forward without fail. These verses remind us that God sees both the large picture, nations, cities, cultures, and the small picture, individuals, families, and personal faith. Even now in our modern world, God still guides His children through changes, growth, and challenges. As ancient civilizations took shape, God was already preparing the way for spiritual blessings that would reach the whole earth. The final section of Genesis 10 brings the Table of Nations to a close, showing how the families of Noah expanded across the world. These names form the roots of many ancient peoples. Though these verses may feel like a list, they teach essential truths about God's relationship with His children. First, this genealogy shows the value of every family. God preserves these names because every life matters to Him. He does not forget His children or their stories. The world may see these ancient people as distant or insignificant, but God sees each one as part of His design. The Bible gives honor to families, whether large or small, well-known or nearly forgotten. Second, these verses show how humanity spread across different lands. People separated into regions, developed languages, and built unique cultures. This global variety was not a mistake, but part of God's plan. Diversity is woven into the fabric of creation. While the world often divides itself, God's desire is that all His children eventually unite in His covenant blessings. Genesis 10 shows that even though people scattered, God's guiding hand never left them. Third, these concluding verses lead directly into the story of Abraham. Shem's line is carefully detailed, quietly preparing the stage for the covenant God will soon introduce. While nations rise and spread, God focuses on one man and one family through whom He will bless all nations. Genesis 10 ends with the reminder that history belongs to God. He knows the path of every nation, but He also knows the heart of every individual. His plan moves forward through generations, often in ways we cannot see. For us today, Genesis 10 encourages us to remember that God knows our ancestry, our struggles, and our potential. We are not random or forgotten. Just like the families in these verses, we are part of a bigger story shaped by God's love. These genealogies may seem simple, but they testify that God is faithful across centuries and families. He remembers His promises and prepares blessings long before we see them. Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9 tells the story of the Tower of Babel, one of the most memorable moments in Scripture. After the flood, humanity still shared one language. Instead of spreading across the earth as God had commanded, the people gathered in the land of Shinar. There they decided to build a city with a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Their goal was not to honor God, but to make a name for themselves. This phrase reveals the heart of the problem: pride. The tower symbolized human self-reliance and glory-seeking. Rather than trusting God, the people trusted in their own power, wanting to create greatness without Him. Pride always leads people away from God and ultimately away from each other. When the people united in arrogance, God intervened, not to punish progress, but to redirect humanity toward His will. He confounded their language, making communication difficult and forcing them to spread across the earth. This scattering fulfilled God's original command to multiply and fill the earth. What looked like a setback was actually protection. God prevented a future where people might become trapped in prideful ambition and spiritual danger. His intervention was an act of mercy. By confusing their language, he protected them from a path that would have led even farther from his presence. This story teaches us important lessons about the difference between pride and humility. Pride builds towers. Humility builds faith. Pride seeks to lift ourselves above others. Humility lifts us closer to God. Pride creates confusion and conflict. Humility leads to unity and peace. The people of Babel tried to build life on their own terms, but without God, their efforts could not stand. Even today, the message is the same. When we build our lives on pride, our abilities, our reputation, our desire to impress, things eventually crumble. But when we follow God humbly, He guides us to where we truly need to be. Babel prepares the world for Abraham, whose humility and obedience stand in direct contrast to the pride of the tower builders. Where Babel fell, Abraham would rise, not through ambition, but through faith. After the dramatic story of Babel, Genesis returns to genealogy, but with a clear, focused purpose. Genesis 11 verses 10 to 20 traces the line from Shem down through generations until it approaches the family of Abram. Unlike the broad table of nations in Genesis 10, this list narrows the spotlight. God is quietly preparing for the covenant that will shape all of Scripture. Each name in this genealogy represents a real life, a real family, and real faith passed down through generations. Arphaxad, Sulla, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor. Many of these names are unfamiliar to us, yet everyone is part of God's preparation for Abraham. This genealogy shows how God works through time. He is patient. He honors righteous ancestors by continuing their blessings through their children. One important detail in this genealogy is the gradual decrease in human lifespans. As generations pass after the flood, people live fewer years. This change signals a shift in the world, perhaps in climate, conditions, or the unfolding of mortality. Life becomes shorter, reminding humanity that time is precious and that God's purposes will move forward at His pace. These verses also teach us that God is faithful even when we do not see immediate results. None of these individuals knew that their descendants would lead to Abraham, or that through Abraham's seed all nations would be blessed. They lived ordinary lives, yet God used them in extraordinary ways. Their quiet faithfulness built the foundation for future revelation. This genealogy teaches us to value the unseen work God is doing in our lives. Sometimes we wonder whether our efforts matter, or whether our obedience makes any difference. Genesis reminds us that God often works through long, slow, generational processes. He keeps promises across centuries. He remembers families. He prepares blessings long before we recognize them. As God guided Shem's line toward Abraham, He also guides our lives toward His purposes, even when we cannot see the full picture. Genesis 11 verses 21 to 32 introduces the family of Terah, the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This passage bridges world history with covenant history. The long line of nations and generations narrows to one household, a family God will soon call to bless the entire world. At this stage, Abram and Sarai appear ordinary. They live in Ur, a thriving ancient city known for trade, culture, and idolatry. Yet God sees something in them that others cannot. He knows their potential and the role they will play in His plan. Terah decides to leave Ur and travel toward Canaan. He brings Abram, Sarai, and Lot. But the journey stops in Haran, where the family settles. This detail matters. God is already moving Abram geographically toward the land He will later promise, even though Abram has not yet been called. Sometimes God prepares our path long before He speaks His invitation. We also learn that Sarai is barren. In ancient times, this was a heartbreaking challenge. Yet her struggle sets the stage for God to show His power. The covenant promises of countless descendants will come only by divine help, not human strength. God often chooses people with limitations, so his miracles are unmistakable. As the genealogy closes, the world is shifting. Nations have spread, languages have divided, civilizations are growing, and families continue their journeys. But in the midst of all these movements, God focuses on one couple. Through Abram and Sarai, he will begin a covenant that reaches every corner of the earth, eventually leading to Jesus Christ himself. Genesis 11 ends with anticipation. A new story is about to begin. God prepares his chosen family, even when they do not yet know what he is doing. This passage encourages us to trust that God knows our journey. He prepares us in ways we may not understand, guiding us step by step toward his promises. Genesis 12 begins with one of the most important invitations in all Scripture. God tells Abram, "Get thee out of thy country." This command requires Abram to leave everything familiar, home culture, security, and go to an unknown land. God does not reveal the destination. He simply says, "A land that I will show thee." This is pure faith. Abram must trust God step by step, without seeing the full path, and he obeys. God promises Abram three powerful blessings: land, posterity, and the promise that in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This final promise points far beyond Abram's lifetime. It is a prophecy of Jesus Christ, who would come through Abram's lineage and offer salvation to all humanity. Abram's obedience opens the door for blessings that stretch across centuries. Abram does not travel alone. Sarai, his wife, goes with him. So does Lot, his nephew. Their journey is long, difficult, and full of uncertainty. Yet they go, trusting that God will guide them. This teaches us about the nature of faith. Faith is not simply believing in God. It is acting on his word, even when the destination is unclear. As Abram arrives in Canaan, God appears to him and confirms the promise. "Unto thy seed will I give this land." Abram responds by building an altar, an act of worship, gratitude, and commitment. He then continues his journey, building another altar and calling on the Lord. Wherever Abram goes, he creates sacred space. His example teaches us to make room for God in every stage of our journey. These verses show that God's call often requires sacrifice. Abram left comfort for covenant, security for promise, the known for the unknown. Yet what he gained, God's presence, guidance, and eternal blessings, far outweighs what he left behind. Genesis 12 teaches us that when God calls, he provides. When we trust him, he leads us to places we could never reach on our own. As Abram travels through Canaan, he pauses at key places to build altars. These altars are symbols of devotion, gratitude, and worship. By building them, Abram shows that God is the center of his journey, not the land, the destination, or the challenges. Every altar is a reminder that God is guiding him. God appears to Abram and reaffirms the promise he first gave. This land will belong to Abram's descendants. This appearance strengthens Abram's faith. But soon after this spiritual high, a famine strikes the land. Famine represents the sudden difficulties that arise even when we follow God faithfully. Abram did everything right, yet hardship still came. Because of the famine, Abram chooses to go to Egypt. This decision shows that even righteous people face moments of uncertainty. Life does not always go smoothly, even when we are on the path God sets. But Abram continues to trust God through the difficulty. These verses teach several important truths. First, worship should happen wherever we are. Abram did not wait until he reached a perfect place to seek the Lord. He worshiped along the way. We too can find God in the journey, not just the destination. Second, God's promises remain true even when circumstances change. A famine does not cancel God's covenant. Trials do not erase blessings. Third, faith is strengthened not only through revelation, but also through adversity. Abram's journey includes both altars and famine, moments of spiritual joy and moments of struggle. Through it all, Abram keeps moving forward. He does not abandon the covenant. He does not lose hope. His example shows that faith is not measured by the absence of trials, but by the perseverance to trust God through them. Genesis 12 verses 6 To 10 invites us to build spiritual altars in our own lives, places of prayer, gratitude, and remembrance as we walk with God. In Genesis 12 verses 11 to 20, Abram faces a difficult test in Egypt. As he enters the land, he fears that the Egyptians will harm him because of Sarai's beauty. His fear leads him to make a choice that was not ideal. He asks Sarai to say she is his sister. Though Abram's intention was self-preservation, this decision places Sarai in danger and shows that even great prophets have moments of weakness. Pharaoh takes Sarai into his household, believing she is unmarried. But God immediately intervenes. He sends plagues upon Pharaoh's house, exposing the truth and protecting Sarai. This divine intervention teaches a powerful lesson. God defends his covenant people, even when they falter. His promises do not depend on human perfection, but on his own faithfulness. Pharaoh confronts Abram, returning Sarai and sending the family away unharmed. Surprisingly, Abram leaves Egypt not empty-handed, but with increased possessions. Even through human error, God's mercy remains. He preserves Abram because the covenant must continue. This moment reveals the nature of God's character. He is patient, protective, and committed to his promises. This passage reminds us that even faithful believers face fear. Abram trusted God enough to leave his homeland, but fear still challenged him in Egypt. God does not abandon his children when they struggle. Instead, he steps in to rescue, guide, and correct. The story shows us that God works through imperfect people. Abram's mistakes did not cancel God's plan. Instead, they highlighted God's grace. When Abram leaves Egypt, he carries with him a deeper understanding of God's power and protection. This experience prepares him for greater responsibilities ahead. Genesis 12 ends with a message of hope. God stays with his people through difficulties, missteps, and fears. His covenant is secure because he is faithful.